So we welcome you, Commissioner, to the Select Committee this afternoon. We all have this report now. Just members, the Primary Production Committee was going to be joining us, but they aren't because they've run over on their session. So I understand you may do a private briefing with them, a separate one. So look, Simon, we will hand it over to you for our remarks. Actually, just before we start, because Barbara has just walked into the room, just going to seek leave of the committee for Barbara Kruger to participate in this briefing this afternoon.
Yes.
Hearing. Okay.
We might have Deborah come in as well.
Yes. And we may have other members join as long as members are happy to grant leave for that participation.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we will hand it over to you for some opening remarks, and yes, be mindful that there'll be plenty of questions, I'm sure.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have with me Dr. Anna Hooper and Dr. Nora Nari. These are the two people who've done a lot of the spade work here, and Matt Patterson, whom I think you know. I'd like to present the key findings from my latest report, which is entitled Reviewing the Use of the LUC System in a Regulatory Context, which was published last December. Let me start by outlining what the LUC system is. LUC stands for Land Use Capability. It's a land classification system which was developed in the 1950s based on an American approach. It was designed to support long-term sustained production on the land. So we did this because we wanted to know about the productive capability of the land. There's 8 classes. I think most of you probably know this, LUC 1 to 8. Within each of those classes, there are subclasses. The subclasses are identified on the basis of the dominant limitation for production. There's 4 potential limitations. I mean, all of them might apply, but only the predominant one is then subclassified. They are erodibility, wetness, soil, and climate. And then there are units within those. But this is the key point. It was never designed to address environmental challenges. It was to tell us what our land could produce. So the first question you might ask is, why review the use of the LUC system? For a biological economy like ours, high quality information about the land and the wider landscape is critical. And it is also critical for high quality environmental regulation. Currently, the LUC system is being relied on to support 3 pieces of national regulation. These are the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land, the National Environmental Standard for Commercial Forestry, and regulation under the Climate Change Response Act to limit ETS-driven farm to forestry conversions. In addition, the LUC system is being used in regional regulatory plans in the context of water quality and nutrient management. Now, given that it wasn't designed to address environmental management challenges, but it's now being used to support regulations, it's prudent, I think, to review whether the system is sufficiently robust, particularly if the proposed new planning system is going to have much more national direction. The key finding of the review is that the LUC system is ill-suited for regulatory use, especially for use at the property scale, and that's due to several limitations. The first is that the LUC system is outdated. This is because the main mapping, which underlies it, was carried out in the 1970s and 1980s, so it's around half a century ago. And that mapping remains unchanged, so it doesn't reflect the situation today, because land management practices such as irrigation or drainage have directly affected the subclass limitation of, say, wetness, for instance. So think about Canterbury, which has been transformed by irrigation. Now, at the time of the mapping, and they did an amazing job with what they had. So we're not being critical of the people who did it. They did a very good job at the time. But they had to use manual technologies and a high degree of expert judgment. And that unavoidably introduces a high degree of subjectivity into the areas or the polygons on the maps and the boundaries between them. The second limitation is that the coarse scale of the mapping makes the national LUC dataset inappropriate for use at a property scale. So the scale of the national LUC dataset is 1 to 50,000. So that means a centimetre on the map equals 500 metres on the ground. But to make operational or site-based decisions, you need maps at the scale of, say, 1 to 5,000, 1 to 10,000, or a centimetre equals 50 metres or 100 metres. Now, as any landowner knows, and there must be a couple in the room, I'm one, the limitations of land can change much more frequently than at 500-metre intervals. I know from my own farm that paddocks can move from well-drained to not so well-drained much, much more swiftly than 50 metres. In fact, I'm having some work done by a student at present just to understand some of this variability. It's really interesting stuff. Now let me outline how these limitations of the LUC system play out in existing national regulations. I'll start with highly productive land. Let's look at a tangible example from the Hawke's Bay, where the council explored. No, it wasn't chosen because of you, Madam Chair. It just happens that they've got very good information in Hawke's Bay.
Yes.
But this is what the regional council explored to identify highly productive land. Now, if you look at this map, so this is just south of Hastings, okay? The pink colours on the map show areas of LUC classes 1 to 3 identified using the national LUC dataset. And if you look at the second map on the right, with the yellow, it shows the class 1 to 3 land that shows up when you use an alternative dataset, in this case, the digital soil map, SMAP, which is much more recent. And as you may be able to see at a glimpse, the areas don't match. There's a bigger version for you. So the teal colour areas show the overlap between the two. So the old one, the old stuff is the pink, and the newer SMAP is the yellow, and they only overlap over 41% of the land area. The rest doesn't. The significant disagreement between the two data sets, similar analysis in Canterbury, by the way, showed an even lower level of agreement, around 21%. Now, the point is that it would need substantial ground truthing to reconcile and validate the two. You'd be ill-advised to rely solely on one or either of the methods for identification of highly productive land. In practical terms, if you were concerned, and you might be, that being classed as highly productive could limit your land use options, then that lack of overlap could spell real problems. Just look at the pink bits just south of Hastings. Hastings is at the top of the map there, and there's teal stuff, so they both agree, but then there's some quite big bits of pink below that. Now, the digital soil map doesn't give these a high status, but LUC does. So you could find yourself in an argument with the regulator if you were in those places. The second illustration I've chosen of how the LUC system plays out is the National Environmental Standard on Commercial Forestry. Now, the NESCF uses the erosion susceptibility classification, that's called ESC for short, which has been derived from the LUC system. And it's a screening tool or threshold test to identify the erosion susceptibility of land intended for forestry. The threshold test is used to determine whether a forestry activity is permitted, subject to certain conditions being met, or whether, no, you've got to get a resource consent. So it's what's used to triage, looking at the land's erosion susceptibility. Now, given that erosion from forestry activities is a key environmental issue, as we know from Tairāwhiti and elsewhere, that this environmental standard is supposed to manage, identifying the risky land accurately is really critical. That relies on the robustness of the erosion classification and the national ESC dataset. So let's just look and practice at what this means. Unfortunately, the ESC, erosion susceptibility, both over and under classifies susceptibility of land to erosion. Now, under classifying land is a problem environmentally because it gives the green light to forestry when maybe more questions should be asked and stricter controls imposed. Let's explore, again with some analysis from the Hawke's Bay. This map shows 3 ESC zones. They're lovely smooth edges. Green with low erosion susceptibility, orange with high susceptibility, and red with very high susceptibility. There is a 4th yellow zone for medium susceptibility, but there wasn't any on this map. Okay, so there's a colour missing. But for this map, there's only three susceptibilities. Just note the uniformity and coarseness of these zones. That reflects the fact that this all goes back to a 1 to 50,000 data set. Okay. Now look at the green zone on the second map. So it's the identical area. Just look at that green zone, but go down to the second map. This adds in recent research from what was till recently called Land Care Research, Manaaki Whenua, which reveals that this area contains areas of high susceptibility to landslides and high connectivity to waterways, and that's the red. So you can see there's plenty of red bits in the green zone. So here, the ESC underclassifies the land. Now, as I've mentioned, underclassifying that land's a real risk because of the more permissive approach the environmental standard takes to management of that land. Now, there are, of course, going to be instances where ESC overclassifies the land and says we should be more cautious than we should be. But the fact of the matter is you can't rely on that ESC alone. And here, just by way of interest, this third map, we have added some additional information overlaying research from Earth Sciences New Zealand, the old GNS. This shows areas in purple with a greater than 80% probability of rainfall-induced landslides. Again, it shows just how coarse the ESC zones are in comparison with the recent research output. But I was keen to include this slide because I think it shows something of the power of newer, finer resolution data sets. The problem is that we do not have them over all of New Zealand. There's lots and lots and lots of gaps. And even when we've got them, they haven't been gathered necessarily in a way that's easy to stitch them together for the purpose that you're concerned about. So that brings me to my recommendations. The first is that as a result of the limitations I've outlined, the current LUC system should not be used as a basis for any future environmental regulation. This recommendation applies both to national and regional regulation through RMA plans. The use of the national LUC dataset for property scale regulation used regularly in RMA plans is particularly problematic. Secondly, the government should invest in progressively improving essential contemporary datasets that underpin land use regulation and ensure they are publicly available and affordable and can be easily integrated. It's one thing to have them, but then if you want to put them together, you need to be sure that they're gathered in a way which enables that to happen. As part of the review, we've identified several such datasets. LiDAR's one, very accurate information on elevation as well as slope, and that's used for a gazillion applications: hazard management, forestry, engineering, flood management. SMAP, which I've mentioned, digital soil map, provides associated information about soil properties. There's something called the land cover database, which tells us what's happening with land cover, you know, forest versus grassland versus wetland versus urban versus bare soil versus water bodies. That one only gets undertaken every 7 or 8 years. And then we need, obviously, comprehensive real-time land use mapping to support spatial planning decisions at the national and local level. Such maps don't currently exist. I mean, there's lots and lots of land use maps, but we do not have a common methodology. There are satellites flying over New Zealand all the time. We do not have that information. I just thought you'd like to see what LiDAR tells you about Parliament. There you are. I think we're in a building. Thirdly, these essential contemporary data sets, and I've only mentioned a handful, there's many, many more than that, a handful. They need to be used to modernise that LUC and ESC system. So you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but they need to be modernised. But I think more importantly, where suitable, we need to create bespoke, fit-for-purpose models for specific regulatory purposes. I think you can imagine a world in which national direction could specify the data requirements and layers needed to address particular problems. But you have to have the layers and you have to have the data, and it has to be in a form you can use it to do that. Finally, we need to focus improvements on areas where better information is most urgently needed. I know this stuff is costly and there are limited resources, so you need to be able to prioritise, and that is what a government should do. For example, in the context of the highly productive land regulation, you need to focus getting the data right in those areas which are under pressure from urban expansion. So that's Auckland, Tauranga, Hamilton, Napier, Hastings, Christchurch. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Finally, some concluding remarks. This review has highlighted that the LUC system isn't fit for purpose certainly for environmental regulation and the sorts of uses it's been put to most recently for the farm forestry conversion thing. And that's really what got me going. The limitations of that system are yet another example of the broader issue, which I keep drawing to this committee's attention, and that is the state of our environmental information. The need for better information, which is the foundation for good decision-making, has been a consistent theme that I have raised with you now and some of your predecessors for 8 years. The new resource management system proposes to make greater use of spatial planning and environmental limits. These will require much, much better information than we have currently available. If you're going to have limits which can stand up in court, which you can justify to your taxpayers, ratepayers and citizens, they need to be based on good quality information. That is not there in many cases. I can't stress to you enough how critical good environmental data and information is for environmental management. I would go further and suggest that without significant investment in the underlying environmental data and information, a proposed planning and environmental management system will fail. With that, we'd be very happy to answer questions, particularly my colleagues, on any of the detail around the science behind this.
Look, thank you very much, Simon. That really insightful, really interesting. And look, I might just take the opportunity to ask the first question, given that you have given Hawke's Bay as an example, and given that it is an issue. The LUC 1, 2, and 3, and all on highly productive land, Hastings, Heratonga Plains, and in terms of development. And you just said it is expensive to look at changing the modelling, but it seemed the maps that you gave, it was the soil that was the differentiating point,
yes.
The soil mapping.
Yep.
And so obviously that would be a priority area that you would recommend, but then also geographically, you said as well. So you've identified the areas that you think as a government, if you were to take on the recommendations, that you would prioritise areas like Hawke's Bay, like Auckland, like Tauranga.
Maybe not Hawke's Bay, because maybe we may actually have better information there. I'm aware, for instance, that there are some parts of New Zealand like Canterbury, like Horizons, Manawatu, where there are significant gaps. Anna can tell you more about the detail of that.
And obviously focusing on the soil is definitely that's kind of the main focus in the context of highly productive land. But both Hawke's Bay and Waikato actually have almost 100% coverage of the SMAP. So they do have that more refined or newer soil information. But it's from memory, Canterbury has gaps, and gaps around 50% of the region still missing that. But obviously the coverage is much better on the plains, essentially the areas where that highly productive land is more likely to be. So if you look only at that, you know, the possible areas for highly productive land, the SMAP coverage is almost 80% for those specific ones. But obviously there are plenty of gaps specifically for on the hills, on the hillier country. So it's not providing maybe as much help for managing erosion issues.
And just a quick supplementary, internationally, in terms of other countries and how they classify their land and, you know, marry it all up, you know, are we behind in terms of a global international sense?
Well, we didn't specifically look into this as part of the LUC review, but we are well aware, especially if you look at Australia, there are quite a few data sets, and they are obviously, you know, huger country, but equally more resources and more sort of efforts, especially from the research community. So it's maybe the question of ensuring that there are those, you know, correct or robust environmental information being available to support policy decisions, but also to support management of environmental issues of concern.
Just on that, can I tell the committee, I'll have a report with you around the middle of the year, which, this is just a little bit of it, which will pull together a lot of what I've been saying about environmental information. I've already sent ministers in advance of coming to Parliament, actually, but it's on my website and I've notified all of you about it, but we produced a piece about integrated environmental data. I'm going to pull that together with an assessment of the way in which some of the new technologies which are out there can change the game in terms of pulling us together. Now, is New Zealand ahead or behind? I mean, look, we've got very good scientists in pockets doing really good bits of stuff. We've got a slew of national data sets, some of them properly funded, some of them literally, it's a, you know, a penny here, a penny there as they could put it together. But we've got bits of it. What is needed is a conscious effort to sit down and prioritise this and invest in it. You know, you can't do it all in a year anyhow, but have a strategy where over a decade we seek to transform things. And we would certainly look at Australia in that context, but other countries as well. And this is the moment to do it, because if you're going to have a resource management system based on permission, subject to things that you monitor, you have to have the information to do that. So this is the moment for this committee to focus on this.
Brilliant, thank you. Ryan Hamilton has a question.
Thanks, Chair. And you probably segued into where I was going, Simon. Last year when we did the climate adaptation framework, this got exposed as being quite rudimentary, and yet it's still sort of formed that foundation of it. And when I questioned, I guess, different entities within our lovely government bureaucracy, no one really knew where it should be housed. And I wonder, I mean, I'm assuming you're relatively agnostic, but who do you think should house this in terms of an entity, a ministry, because it crosses over so many different places?
Yeah, housing sort of has a physical sense to it. Someone's got to lead it, and my suggestion to ministers was that they should actually sit down and identify who leads. Now, you know, we said, well, you could look at statistics, you could look at LINs, you could look at environment. Now, the government's abolishing the Ministry for the Environment. I don't have the answer there. I'm rather attracted by the idea of LINs, actually. But look, it is a question, it's not a question of saying, here is the commander-in-chief and they're going to do it all. It is a question of having the leadership to look across our system to ask how it can talk to, bits can talk to one another, where the investment is needed. That needs a government-wide strategy. So in a sense, that's really the first decision I think a ministerial level discussion should move to seek advice on where that should be. And there is no right answer to that, but we've got to get on with it. And as you say, adaptation, this is a classic. There are so many data sets which you need to be able to put together, whether it's because of landslip and so on, and I've shown you some bits there, or whether it's coastal sea level change or whatever. We need fit for purpose data to make good decisions, for insurers to make good decisions, for the government to make good decisions.
And David has a question.
Thank you. I think the first thing that comes to mind is what are the perverse outcomes that are occurring as a result of the coarse nature or the lack of appropriateness of the data sets that are, or the information that's before us? Because regions often have occasions where they need to do some work and they have to make a decision on what tools they use to do that well.
Sure.
And a lot of that sometimes comes back to that crude cost-benefit analysis of can we afford to be at this coarse nature to be able to serve the purposes of what we are.
Yeah.
We've also got councils around New Zealand that within the rules at a high level, that when anything does get done on a day-to-day basis, it comes down to a farm lot level where you get that closer analysis to get the true context at the far more granular stage type thing. So I think, everybody empathises, we would all love the best data we could get, and we would like this to be done every week so that we've got current data, because even LIDAR, you do it today, next year it's out of date type thing. So we want this, but it comes down to a cost situation.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if it's a cost situation, what is it that's incentivising decision makers to actually say it's worth the investment for what we're actually trying to achieve here?
Yeah. Well, see, this raises, I've thought about this a lot. I'm a landowner. I know how my land's classified under all these things. I can tell you they don't match up. They simply don't match up. And so from a regulatory point of view, I could get told to do something because the council says, well, cost benefit of us doing this fine grain isn't worth it. You just have to live with, that. You see, the thing about the Resource Management Act is that it wasn't, it said, well, we don't have the information, let's gather it. So we've lived in a world which was costly and in some cases slow because you had to get the information, not for the ordinary farming operation that's already a permitted use, but all sorts of things. Somebody's coming in to do something which isn't happening. Okay, you've got to get a report on this. So you gather all of this information, much of it held by government entities, which taxpayers have funded to provide this, but they may well be charging for it now. But you pull all of this together. So the cost is at the front end, and then you get the resource consent and you go and do it. When you move to a system which says, look, we're not going to ask questions at the front end. We've pre-decided this is okay, provided, and we'll monitor it. Then you haven't got the luxury of saying, well, is it worth getting the information or not? You don't know. You're going to have to invest in the information to make the system flow easily. So I think there's very significant efficiency gains under the proposed legislation, provided it's based on good quality information. So, you take a choice. You either spend up front or you spend after. And I think that's really that's the debate the committee needs to think about in the context of these bills.
You'd only spend afterwards if you're having litigation or all sorts of problems with the system.
But then also, it's supplementary to that. There's a cost potentially to the value of the land, because if you get reclassified and you suddenly go from a class 1 to a class 4 or 5, well, obviously that land is potentially not as valuable as it was under the older system, but then it could be the flip of that, I suppose.
I would.
Who's buying land on there?
I'd encourage your land. Have a look at the LUC maps. Have a look at the S map. Have a look at anything else you can find, because there are some amazing stuff actually, which is very granular. There's some stuff which is just plain wrong.
Jo has a question.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed reading through this report of yours. I just have a question with regard to the slide where you talk about underestimating site-specific areas that could be more prone to erosion than what has been noted. given the erosion that we've seen with the weather events, you know, like Cyclone Gabrielle and all of that type of slipping, etc. I mean, do you think that these data sets have aided or hindered good legislation making? And the reason I ask that is if we think about the climate change response amendment bill that was passed that provides exemptions for forestry expansion on LUC 7 and 8 land, if it remains unchanged, I mean, are we likely to see worse erosion outcomes for Tairāwhiti?
I don't know, I haven't investigated that, but, you know, I mean, my point, I think I made the point to you that if you don't have good quality information and to take David's point, you know, well, cost benefit, is it worth really finding this out? No, on balance, we won't. We'll just, you know, we'll go with the course data. Well, this is where you pay later when suddenly you've underclassified, you haven't got the right consent, you know, requirements or permitted use requirements. All the stuff comes down the river and you're paying after the event. So, you know, if you pay for the information in advance, then you can hopefully avoid that in the future, which is why I'd say that investing in these data sets is really a major economically significant investment. And look, it's not just for environmental purposes. You know, for economic purposes, it is really useful for landowners to have access to this. Now, you could say, oh no, if it's private, they should pay for it. So then we've got every landowner in New Zealand going off and contracted to find this stuff. I'm actually a believer in governments having a role to provide public good information. I think it's good for the economy. I think it's good for the environment.
Joe, you have something?
Yeah, thank you, and stuff on that. So, given what we're seeing in these weather events, and Tairāwhiti is another example, and you talked about perhaps focusing on the hotspots, and I would assume that would be one of those areas. How much urgency do you think that this government or future governments should really put on something like this?
As I've said, you should prioritise the hotspots. In fact, I think you'll find, the colleagues can correct me here, but as a result of events up the coast, we've got much better data there than we have in other places in New Zealand. But it's been a case of after the event.
Have you got any thinking around a time limit for, you know, like within 5 years, 2 years?
Well, as I've said, I mean, it all comes down to resources, and governments don't have unlimited resources. No. But I'd have thought that a realistic sort of time frame might be to say a decade from now, we want to have completely changed the data landscape for New Zealand and make it a big national priority. I don't think it's party political. Everyone can sign up to this. It would help everybody. But it requires, you know, this is the thing, it requires more than just, all right, well, look, we found some money for this year. It's a question of having a strategy, I think. Ellie,
I was going just to add specifically on Tairāwhiti. You might be aware that obviously the council there, since the cyclone, has produced a map really on the back of the research by BSI, which Simon has also showing essentially the areas of high landslide susceptibility and high connectivity to waterways. So really thinking about not just what land is more likely to erode, but where are these areas that are then going to affect the waterways, i.e. all this sediment, all the debris, everything going down the slope into the waterways. But that map has been produced after, as a result, you know, of the event.
But in a supplementary to that though, I mean, this is, we're talking about cost and the benefit, I suppose it's climate mitigation as well, right? Because, you know, if you look in Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti during Cyclone Gabrielle, like a lot of that slash came down from the hills, and like there was a lot of questioning at the time in terms of the land use and, you know, the classification of the land and whether I suppose it should have been planted. And this, if there was a better mapping and better data, potentially, you know, that may not happen in future.
I mean, just if I may, I think you should take an interest as a committee in the changes to the science system, because the way we fund research is changing, and I'm taking a very close interest in this, and I'll bring a report to you at some stage on what it means. But I think I certainly don't think the system as we have it is necessarily very transparent. It's often hard to work out why stuff is happening and why it isn't happening. But we're moving to, I think, a more transparent system, and the government's putting a lot of eggs on the economic basket. It will be interesting to see what priority they give to environmental research. But key to this are some of these data sets which are used in research and they are research-based. It is critically important, again, in the science reforms, that the system can actually pick up these priorities and fund them. So this is linked not just to the resource management reforms, but it's also linked to the science reforms.
Lam.
Thank you so much for this. And this question would probably take like a whole research program.
Oh, well.
Don't encourage them.
I just wondered if you had any thoughts, because is it right that SMAT is like 2020, like much more up to date?
I'll just be
It's
civil.
regularly updated.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they keep on expanding it, and the latest update was 2025.
Okay, but the LUC was between the 70s and 90s.
No,
50.
it's earlier than that, 70s,
The
80s.
initial mapping was 1970s and 80s, and then there was some
Okay.
additional mapping in the early
Right,
90s.
yeah.
But not.
Do you
Yeah,
think
okay.
even in, because the overlap data was so interesting, like, do you think there's even potentially something in that about potentially the changing forms of our land use, say, obviously post, deforestation and everything like that, like could even the differences between them be that the land itself
I see.
is actually quite different?
Well, I've wondered about this actually. I mean, I tend to think, if you're thinking, this is a really interesting thought, what's the echo of original land clearance going back to both, Polynesian arrival, that sets a whole raft of things happening. Then 700 years later, you have another massive thing. Those processes don't happen in a year or 2 years. They can take decades, if not centuries. So there's probably echoes of the past running around in all of this. But to be frank, I don't think the sort of research tools and databases we're running now are picking those up.
No,
That would be my instinct.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
It's an interesting question.
Very interesting.
to have,
Yes,
But what's important is what is today, what's real time, because we're talking about
yes.
utilising regulation.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
but it's
was,
an interesting question.
I mean, that's the sort of fundamental research question, though, that I think a public research system should be able to fund, because you never know what insights you get out of that sort of work. I mean, it's not a silly question. You can't put a vast amount of money into that because this is pretty expensive. But at the corner of your investment portfolio,
and particularly about if you're investing at scale, you also want to understand how that might change, and maybe that information,
Yes.
the overlays you're doing could actually help inform that as
yeah.
well.
yeah.
One example that I will give, for example, actually again, on the back of the cyclone in Gisborne, and we've got this example here, they have flown the LiDAR again. So essentially they got two time points where they've obtained the elevation data. And it shows essentially before the cyclone and after. And it shows quite big differences, especially when they use the specific technique that really shows the areas where either a lot of sedimentation has happened and essentially landslides or earth flows have occurred, or obviously the areas of accretion where sediment just got deposited. And that is the thing that you get really from doing like at least having at least 2 time series, not a one-off.
Yeah.
Look, we've got time for one last question before we have to wrap it up, and we'll take that from Rachel Brooken.
Yeah, thank you. I hear your continued message about the
that's good.
to be able to make spatial plans workable in Hatchets.
Yes.
On this point, and that this data is just not good enough, is it fair, or is there a way of looking at what's in this report as there's soil and soil quality, so productivity of soil is one thing, and then there's erosion, and we've talked about sediment running off, and also we've got slips and all those sorts of hazards. That's my first question. And then the next one is if you can give us some idea of the costs that might be involved, particularly for these hotspots, whether that's erosion or it's soil productivity, if you were a shake of the head.
The answer is no, because we haven't gone in and done that. But look, to give you a sense, there are when it comes to understanding what's happening in the landscape from a sort of a climate and adaptation point of view, there is probably 10 or 15 data sets running there. There's the National Climate Database, that costs about $10 million a year to maintain. There's the National River Flows Database, same, roughly $10 million. National Landslide Database, about $10 million a year to run that. These are numbers that the MFEs shared, that they're just looking at this right now. But there is a ton of stuff here. You know, there's probably tens of millions being spent right now in maintaining these at various levels of updatedness. You know, now, and that's only, ones I'm talking about there are only about the sort of adaptation, you know, rain, climate, soil, landslide stuff. If you want to then get into biodiversity, if you want to get into land use for productive purposes, then that's other data sets that you need. So what's needed is, I think, a complete piece of housekeeping, an inventory. And you see, if I just add this little fact, Madam Chair, when I was the minister in 1992, we actually put together a list of significant databases and collections, which, whatever the contestability of the funding system, had to be funded. That list has not changed in over 3 decades. Now, that is just crazy because we're living in a different world. There are whole new data sets which have come into existence, but they're not nationally significant. So this has really got to be picked up and looked at seriously.
No, look, thank you very much for your time today. We have met time.
But is it a useful thing to think about the soil productivity differently from the erosion, or?
Well, you need to put the two together because we use land. So you want to know, okay, how productive, but then how susceptible. That may change what you can do on the land. Yeah.
No, really interesting report and a lot for us to think about. So thank you for your time today. Really
Pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yep.